Good evening. London, England. A busy, modern city. I want to ask you, if I may tonight, to join me in an experiment. An experiment to turn back time. To suspend belief in the here and now and journey into the past. Come with me now to a London before 2 wars, when the city was very different to the one we live in now. This house you see behind me was the London home of one of the most powerful men of this century.
We're filming.
After the success of Monty Python, Michael Palin and Terry Jones decided to embark on a radical new comedy series. Set in the heyday of Empire, Ripping Yarns was a series of 9 glorious comedy dramas, broadcast between 1976 and 1979. It featured schoolboys, soldiers, explorers.
We only left Paddington at 4:30. I've already lost him then.
Spies, and a whole host of mad colonial characters.
Excellent.
From a long-lost era.
Set her free, Mrs. Angel.
She is free here. There's been no slavery in this country for donkey's years.
We've used a lot of very conventional establishment attitudes, but undermined them.
Right, Morrison. I think you know what to do.
The way he could deal with it was with humour.
Ripping Yarns took its inspiration from the boys' books and magazines that were popular up until the Second World War.
I think we were celebrating the British Empire and the boys' own stories, really. I think they were celebrating that.
Before the days of video games and cartoons, these stories fueled the imaginations of generations of young people. They were tales full of empire, adventure, British pluck, danger, daring-do, and these colossal, larger-than-life heroes. These are the real Ripping Yarns. Until relatively recently, being a boy meant certain things. You explored the outdoors.
And I used to cycle all over the place without anybody worrying.
We're in the forest, in the woodlands, and we knew every tree, and we went wild, we'd be out all day.
Nowadays, I think people are so worried about letting their children go off and do something on their own.
You had hobbies.
I've got some very good stamps, actually, and nice.
So I used to get lots of stamps on approval, and then I realised that if I didn't write back within a week, I'd bought them. So my father had to take me to one side and say, stamp collecting can lead you into sort of dangerous ways, rack and ruin.
Kitts and Nevis, Natal, Falkland Islands, unmarked.
You were expected to be resilient.
After the war, there was very little around, and life was pretty grim. And I think that was very much the ethos to deal with, the difficult times. Make yourself a man, harden yourself up.
You respected the establishment, and you were proud to be British.
It was inculcated into us at primary school that we were right at the heart of this empire. We were told it was the biggest empire ever,
So when they sat down to write what would become Ripping Yarns, Palin and Jones looked back to their childhoods. Compared to the groovy 70s, the world they grew up in, so steeped in old-fashioned pluck and Victorian values, seemed ripe for mockery.
It was my brother who suggested we do stories from boys' own paper.
All the stuff that I've giggled at the back of the class in school, these heroic attitudes, actually you can see it all from a different perspective. And that there's quite a lot in it which was ridiculous and which was absurd and which humour could deal with.
The first of the ripping yarns was Tomkinson's school days.
Sorry, Grayson. You called me school bully. You miserable little tick. I went to public school and I remember I was given a book before I went there. My father said, this is a book about the school, old boy, and it's called The Bending of a Twig. And it was all about some boy, some young lad of initiative and individuality who had been sort of sent to the school and then gradually being worn down to become the useful member of society he was to be later on. But it was called The Bending of a Twig, and it was all really about what the schools are about, which is getting people and giving them discipline.
Everything about the place seemed designed to crush the soul and break down any reserve of pride I ever had.
Thank you, Foster.
Beating the headmaster was just one of those ghastly...
Changing their nature very slightly, very...
Well, turning them into sort of conformists. Yeah, exactly.
I think Tomkinson's school days came out of Mike being horrified when his parents sent him to boarding school. I think there's a lot of bile in that, and I think that's what it came from, the cruelty of it.
O Lord, we give thee humble and hearty thanks for this thy gift of discipline, knowing that it is only through the constraints of others that we come to know ourselves, and only through true misery can we find true contentment.
Tomkinson's school days pokes fun at the school story. These tales, usually set in boys' public schools, were popularised by the legendary Boys' Own paper, but appeared in hundreds of other books and magazines too. Whether written in 1910 or 1950, the school story never strayed far from a tried and tested formula. Now, the school story has only a few ingredients: public school, group of chums, and an arch enemy, usually an evil headmaster or possibly a school bully. But always a few scrapes, more often than not, a bit of healthy sporting rivalry. And that's pretty much it. And these ingredients remain unchanged for decade after decade after decade, as comforting and reassuring as a mug of hot cocoa. It's hard to convey just how popular these stories were. They appeared weekly in the Boys' Own paper and in scores of copycat magazines like Magnet, Gem and Chums.
We need to understand what a central part of youth culture they were. We have one survey from St Pancras in the 1930s which found that 86% of boys were reading at least one magazine a week, and an astonishing 15% said that they were reading 6 boys' weeklies every week.
Typically, stories were serialised first in the boys' weeklies and later published in book form, thus launching a writer's career. One best-selling writer, almost totally forgotten today, was Talbot Baines-Reed, known as Tibby. He wrote the wildly popular Fifth Form at St Dominic's. I say wildly popular. This sold over 250,000 copies in 1907 alone. Absolutely fantastic book. I'm going to read you a little bit from chapter 4. "Well bowled, sir," shouted Master Paul, as a very swift ball from Ricketts took Bullinger's middle stump clean out of the ground. "Rattling well bowled, I say." Now, you see, to us that sounds very comical.
Well, this is a dash bad show, I must say.
But you have to remember that at the time, this kind of language of the school stories was widely copied.
Well, that's it. Good egg, good egg.
Just as much like American slang might be picked up, like totally, by children watching cartoons today. There were bounders of the remove and rotters of the fourth. Boys swanked and gassed and said things like, "I say," ripping, and
Oh my hat!
This was a private language that set children apart from the boring world of adults. The most prolific writer of school stories was Charles Hamilton, also known as Frank Richards, Clifford Owen, Owen Conquest, and several other pseudonyms. Charles, Frank, Martin, whatever you want to call him, is estimated to have written close to 100 million words in his lifetime. And he began a lengthy career in 1908 with a story written for the Magnet magazine, later published as a book. Richard's character Billy Bunter, the fat owl of the remove, is probably the most famous of all his creations.
Look out, here comes Squelch.
We look at someone like Charles Hamilton, Frank Richards, and we look at how much he's writing. It is absolutely extraordinary. We're talking about, over his lifetime, probably the equivalent of 1,000 full-length novels. He's said to have invented somewhere between 50 and 100 different schools using his various pseudonyms. He's got these whole school stories. He's churning out thousands and thousands of words, perhaps 70,000 words a week. It is absolutely extraordinary. How can that not be pap?
How I long to be able to hop like the second-year boys, and not have to ask permission to breathe out after 10:30.
Much of the magic of the school story came from its depiction of arcane rules and rituals.
There was also the compulsory fight with the grizzly bear, which all new boys had to go through.
Have this idea that the boy arrives on day one and has to be broken, frankly. So whether it's the bullying or the fagging, or being made to stand on a table and sing a solo and all of that kind of thing, is all about eradicating what the boy was like before. Just get rid of all of that, begin again, and you can be remade in the image of the school.
Physical hardship and the occasional flogging were all part of the fabric of school life. Corporal punishment wasn't just regarded as a necessary evil in schools, but as an actual benefit to the boys. It was character forming. No pupil could hope to gain the respect of his peers until he had been given 6 of the best.
Hello, Mumsy.
What he needs is a damn good thrashing.
Clive, please.
He needs the skin taken off his back with a triple-thonged bamboo back leather strip. That's what he needs.
And there was St. Tadger's Day, when, by an old tradition, boys who had been at the school for less than 2 years were allowed to be nailed to the walls by senior parents.
I dare say there was no nailing to the walls going on it.
There was no nailing to the walls, but, they only stopped just short of that. But what I liked in Tompkinson's school days was, that you could do it with a twist. So it wasn't that the boys were nailed to the walls, it was the boys were allowed to be nailed to the walls.
Yes.
That was a privilege. That was
yes.
good. You got on in school.
School bully?
Casting a dark shadow over the proceedings was the school bully.
He had twice won the public school's bullying cup, and last year beat the extraordinarily vicious Ackroyd of Charterhouse at a kick-in of fags at the Hurlingham show.
In those days, people say bullying was that's part of school. You were going to find that old boy, have to deal with it.
Let's do it.
Thank you. Thank you, bully.
In Tompkinson, parents sent their children to that school to be bullied by him because he had won the public school's bullying cup. So that was an observation really on where we were with the kind of social attitudes at the time.
Of course, many a school story centres around some kind of sporting contest. Encouraging fair play and hard physical combat was seen as a vital part of education.
Goal! He's won! He's bloody won!
The very first issue of the Boys' Own paper in 1879 kicked off with a story called My First Football Match. For the next 90-odd years, the paper ran articles on almost every sport you can think of. From the obvious ones, cricket, rugby and hockey, to the more obscure like Harrow Footer and the Eton Wall Game.
Both sides push and shove and heave and tug, but murder is far.
There was this tremendous emphasis on physical education and on games. That's why there's so much about rugby and cricket, because these are believed to be healthy. And in the correspondence column of the Boys' Own paper, you get so many requests about how can I get stronger, how can I grow to be a taller boy, how can I become more muscular, and so on. So there's terrific concern there about manliness. How can we become more manly?
After 12 and a half miles, I saw Benner of 5A fall and die of exhaustion. And after 17 miles, he was joined by Apsley, Cridworth, P.E., Spitwell, Emerson, and Zappa Major.
This interest in sport was all part of a more general preoccupation with the physical. I'm going to read you this fantastic looking Gorilla Hunters here by R.M. Ballantyne, and there's a passage here which I think sums it up pretty well. He says, boys ought to practice leaping off heights into deep water. They ought never to hesitate to cross a stream on a narrow, unsafe plank for fear of a ducking. They ought never to decline to climb a tree to pull fruit merely because there is a possibility of their falling off and breaking their necks. I firmly believe that boys were intended to encounter all kinds of risks in order to prepare them to meet and grapple with the risks and dangers incident to man's career with cool, cautious self-possession, a self-possession founded on experimental knowledge of the character and powers of their own spirits and muscles. Of course, risk-taking these days in the 21st century is something that is ought to be avoided at all costs. It's a big part of the Boys' Own literature as well, actually, the necessity of risk, actually, and embracing risk, facing up to it, not shying, not avoiding it.
Yeah, that was definitely a part of it. You should learn these things, and you should learn the hard way. I mean, discomfort was very important, because life is going to be uncomfortable.
What are those, Uncle Jack?
Oh, they're buboes, lad. Touch of bubonic plague I picked up at the weekend.
Gosh, weren't you scared?
Oh, bit of bubonic plague? I should say not. So long as you get a rabid dog to lick the poison out. Want to see the rats?
Oh, rather.
Go on ahead.
Alongside school stories and sport, one of the big features of the Boys' Own paper was the hobbies pages.
What is that, Tomkinson?
It's a model icebreaker, sir.
It's a bit big for a model, isn't it?
It's a full-scale model, sir.
The Boys' Own paper had a very high kind of interactive quality to it. You could turn to the pages of how to make things, do it yourself. And in these you could make a toy yacht, a toy fire engine, furniture. They have to make their own patterns, diagrams, cut things out, heat wood, bend it, do all kinds of things with apparatus that we would have no idea how to use today.
Hobbies were very important. They were part of the established sort of way of growing up. My father had been a great collector of birds' eggs, which of course now you wouldn't be really allowed to do, all these little birds' eggs. I went for the more predictable things. I was a train spotter. I also collected cheese labels.
Dad was a keen collector of stamps, so he got me going. I collected only stamps in the British Empire.
There was no room for dullards on the hobbies pages. They provided a stern test for the boy reader.
One of the things that I love about the Boys' Own paper is the way that it assumes that boys are really competent and can be trusted with all kinds of equipment and ways that health and safety in schools today would find absolutely shocking. When they're preserving insects, for instance, they're told from the very beginning that the chemist might not sell you this because it's a dangerous poison, and if he does sell it to you, you have to be careful about how you store it and make sure that nobody else can get it.
The Boys' Own Paper hobbies pages had a particular focus on science, although there was nothing dry or classroomy in the way they wrote about it. They cleverly wrapped up scientific concepts in articles about popular hobbies. So you would learn about fluid dynamics in an article about boat building, or about zoology in an article about collecting insects. And of course it was all done with such breathless enthusiasm that no boy could fail to be captivated. Now I've come here to the Royal Institution in London to conduct an experiment that was first written up in the Boys' Own Paper in the 1880s. So, what do you make of my spiders?
I think they're fantastic. Yes.
I'm joined by Dr. Peter Wathers from Cambridge University, no less,
I saw that one.
to have a go at making exploding spiders.
We're sort of following a recipe from a Boys' Own Paper from the 1880s.
This is written by a chemist, John Scoffin, at the time.
And it's sold as a jape. You basically make your little spider here, and he even says you can stick it by means of a gun to the wall, and then when your maiden aunt comes in and thinks there's a spider on the wall, she reaches for her parasol, gives it a prod, and the result is very funny.
Now we need the chemical part, which is trying to make these things explode.
What is the compound we're going to be putting in there?
So it's something called nitrogen triiodide, which is an incredibly sensitive explosive. I mean, in fact, it can't be used as an explosive because you can't move it once it's been made.
So how are you going to do that? What's the process?
So I'm going to go away and make it, prepare it wet. But as soon as it's dried,
That's it.
it's pretty unstable stuff.
Now, what's extraordinary, and I think laudable, is that in a Boys' Own Paper, they're being entrusted with the recipe for making this quite unstable, extremely unstable compound. I mean, would you ever get this happening now? I mean, would any child be allowed to put this together themselves now?
I can't see today's chemistry sets telling you exactly how to make this sort of compound.
We can't show you how the compound is made. It's apparently too dangerous. So you're going to have to look at a picture of spiders now. And another picture. And another. Good, aren't they? You see, in the 1880s, they didn't really bother with health and safety. Once Peter returns with the explosive compound, it's time to load up our spiders.
Careful not to drop any little bits.
Right. Is that a good quantity in there, do you think, or should we do a bit more?
Let's have a little bit more. Just don't knock the other ones. But I wouldn't scrape too hard.
That's a nervous laugh, isn't it?
It's I've seen this before. Laugh. Okay. Good. Right.
So, Peter, we've both been issued with a standard issue Maiden Aunt's parasol with which to prod the spiders.
So shall I attack the first one?
Yeah, attack the first one.
Okay, let's give it a prod then.
Yeah, that worked. I tell you what, it's upset this one there, but these...
there's a leg.
Oh, there we are, a little memento for me. Yeah. Dish.
You got over.
Oh, I wasn't doing it hard enough.
You're getting good at it now.
And if the boy reader made a mistake, he couldn't get his spiders to explode, or he had some other burning question, he would send a letter to the editors of the paper asking for help.
They'd never published the letters, so you just get the replies. You had to kind of try and work out what the query might have been. And this is from Boys' Own Paper, it must have been about sort of just before the war, First War, that is. And I'll just couple here, because they're so wonderful. Fred L. They was identify the writer. So Fred L. 1. By all means, remove your moustache if you're only 5 feet high. It may not help your growth, but there's no harm in trying it. What are we doing here? At any rate, you're sure of a little fresh air when you let it grow. And then 2. It makes no difference if you do not overtie yourself.
That's it.
So they're just wonderful. And there's a last one here, which is just, again, a lovely non sequitur. It's called Swallow, and it has 1. The birds must have been included in the catalogue in error. They're certainly not British, so it was very admonitory tone, and have never been recognised as such. And then 2, have a cold bath every morning. Wash yourself all over, head and all. What's that got to do with swallows? But anyway, yeah.
The idea of the cold bath, so beloved by the Boys' Own Paper, was first popularised by its no-nonsense correspondent, Dr. Gordon Stables. A former Arctic explorer, naval surgeon, and fanatical caravaner, Stables had some very trenchant opinions. He was a health nut, advocating fresh air, lifting dumbbells, never smoking, and of course, endless cold bathing. Take a cold tub, sir. This is what Stables would recommend to all his readers on a very regular basis. In fact, a cold bath was his remedy for any kind of affliction, whether psychological or physical. In fact, he even advised working boys to rise at 5, scrub themselves down in a cold tub so they could get dressed, comb their hair, and be at work for 6. That is... Okay, here goes. I can feel my character building before your very eyes. I think that's probably enough of that. I have to get up and dressed, comb my hair. I could probably be at work by 6. The cold tub was something he advised as a remedy for another sort of problem that worried many of his teenage readers. Stables speaks of nervousness and certain debilitating habits learnt at school that lead to trouble that can never be shaken off. He was referring, of course, to the menace of self-abuse. The correspondence pages of the Boys' Own Paper are filled with dire warnings of what might happen to boys who gave in to these dangerous and unnatural urges. Those habits lead thousands to misery and illness, and often to death or insanity. You will ruin your constitution and earn for yourself a miserable manhood. Such habits often end in lunacy and suicide. Don't trust to quacks or men who send out pamphlets and advertise. Banish madness from your mind and leave the dog alone. To our modern ears, these letters make for pure comedy, but at the time this was serious stuff. The whole of British society was worried.
I will not have the trappings of whoremongery and free lovism under this roof. No, don't touch it! Turn away, woman, lest it arouse you to unseemly lubricity. This is the devil's work.
People tried all sorts of weird and wonderful means to prevent themselves becoming aroused.
These are called Jugend penises, and...
They're called what?
The great name of Jugend penises.
Jugend?
Right. And they were designed to prevent what the Victorians called spermatorrhea, a slightly deadly term that essentially means the unnecessary loss of semen.
I suppose they felt there was a finite supply, did they?
Well, it was held in very, very high regard, and what they thought was this unnecessary loss would make you ill. So spermatorrhea caused a very, very wide range of debilitating illnesses, both physical and mental.
And how does this work? Let's just get down to the nitty-gritty. See, it's got a kind of bicycle clip in the...
It would have been worn at night,
Okay.
and the idea being that should the sleeper become unnaturally aroused, should we say, the pain would wake you up because you would engage with these teeth around the edge.
Right.
And there were a number of different contraptions all along similar lines, through to whole bodysuits that you could wear to bed at night, we think, that had flaps at various strategic points that could be closed or opened accordingly.
What are you making, Mother?
Something that will cover the entire human body, dear.
You say there was a school of thought. It becomes almost more than a school. It becomes almost the rule that
Absolutely.
you must at all costs avoid.
So this was really taken up not just within medical circles, but by moralists, educators, and then society.
The word we come across again and again is self-pollution.
Self-pollution.
Self-pollution. So here we've got, representing the last stage of mental and bodily exhaustion from onanism or self-pollution. I mean, surely that just passes, though. That's only for a couple of minutes. And then he's back on his feet.
I mean, it could kill you. The effects could be, that's what they were
This is just, I mean, this is nonsense, isn't it? I mean, how extraordinary. Or is it? Maybe, or are you here to tell me otherwise?
Well, no, I mean, I think it sort of fueled this anxiety and it snowballed, so everybody was terrified of the effects that this might have.
Over the years, the tone of the letters pages mellowed a little. In the 30s, personal issues were dealt with in a column called The Padres Talk, and in the 40s by Between Ourselves. But the advice remained much the same.
May I touch you, Captain?
No. Oh, it's bad enough with a girl, but you're a man.
Sexual thoughts were to be avoided.
Part of what the ripping yarns were things that were unexpressed, There was a certain level of repression, a certain level of real sexual hang-ups. They were just touched on because you weren't allowed to touch on them, so even just referring to them made them funny.
Well, Mr. Russell, since you are a man, maybe it would be all right for me to rub something on them.
Keeping boys' energies focused on innocent and improving pursuits was one of the aims of the boys' weeklies. In the boys' own paper, much was made of the importance of bracing outdoor activities, such as natural history, gardening, and hiking.
They wanted to produce a kind of wholesome image of boyhood that was exciting as well. They wanted the boys to go out, to exercise, to play games, to get involved in sport, to climb trees with jackknives, to take risks, to be what we now think of as proper boys.
This focus on the great outdoors had grown out of turn-of-the-century concerns about the malign influence of cities. Many people believed the country was going to the dogs, locked into a toxic cycle of physical and moral degeneration. After decades of industrialization, the cities were growing, and along with them a huge urban underclass, poorly fed, unfit, and, it was believed, steeped in crime and immorality.
There was a kind of question in society, had the grit of the modern boy become somehow diminished?
Hello, you boy in the corner there. You ought to be a Boy Scout. You're a fine-looking fella, and I know you'd make a jolly good backwoodsman by the look of you. You're ugly enough anyway.
Robert Baden-Powell, a columnist for the Boys' Own paper, founded the Scout movement in 1908 with the explicit intention of improving the caliber of the modern boy.
Baden-Powell hoped that by creating a youth movement built around the countryside about camping and woodcraft, that this would counteract the evil effects of the city and improve the health of the nation's youth.
As well as encouraging their readers to get outdoors, the Boys' Weeklies provided plenty of manly role models to inspire them. The strong, intrepid, outdoorsy hero is a recurring figure in boys' fiction, and of course nobody was more celebrated than the explorer. Whether he was conquering the Arctic wastes or fighting his way through the Amazon, the explorer's every move was minutely charted by boys' books and magazines.
What's your expedition looking for?
Well, we're looking to see if there's a channel, a river passage, linking the Ganges with the Brahmaputra River through Bhutan.
But this is Maidenhead.
The figure of the explorer loomed large in popular culture until well into the 20th century.
I wanted to be an explorer. That's from very early on. I mean, 9 or 10 years old. That's what I wanted to do. And I read stories of great explorers, especially people who disappeared. And I was fascinated by people who were never seen again. There were stories like Fawcett, Colonel Fawcett, and that he went off to the Amazon, was never seen again. Someone said, dead, believed eaten. 1953, I was 10 years old, that's when Everest was climbed, so someone who got to the top of the highest mountain, they'd found the source of the Amazon and the source of the Nile and all that sort of thing, so there was very little left. But the idea of exploration appealed to me greatly, and I think it was not just because they were brave men, but they were going to places that no one had ever seen before.
The Boy's Own paper published stirring tales like In the Power of the Pygmies and Nearly Eaten, in which a professor escapes from a horde of voodoo-worshipping cannibals in Haiti. Explorer novels like King Solomon's Mines were a fixture on every boy's bookshelf. Tales like these, usually set in remote outposts of the Empire, provided readers with a heady mix of exoticism and danger.
The Polar Explorer, Rear Admiral Sir Vincent Smythe Olsen. Applause, applause!
Polar exploration was a recurring theme for the Boy's Own paper. It printed no less than 17 articles on Scott of the Antarctic, particularly the ill-fated Terra Nova expedition, which took the lives of Scott and his comrades.
Scott and Oates in particular were really raised as the preeminent heroes in Britain on the eve of the First World War, and the Boy's Own paper played a significant part in that process. They actually published a special plate of Captain Oates with a line saying, "This plate of Captain Oates should find an honoured place in the den of every BOP reader."
And not all of these explorer heroes were even grown men. In the 1920s, we were introduced to James Marr, the 18-year-old Boy Scout who accompanied Ernest Shackleton on a trip to the Antarctic. The story of the expedition, written by Marr himself, was serialized in Chums magazine and then later published as a book in 1923. It must have been the most incredible adventure for this young 18-year-old scout, but I imagine no picnic. I mean, he was working as a normal member of the crew, working day and night. Judging by the way he's writing it, he's certainly in the teeth of it all. He's getting the full experience. Listen to this. Wednesday, the 28th of December, 1921. The gale had increased to hurricane violence. It was a grand sight to watch those foam-decked mountains of water bear down upon us. I bet it was. The ship rose on top of them like a cork and then down the other side. Woohoo! And that's tough. That's really tough. And remember, as I say, he's 18-year-old. I suppose if anyone questioned the sense of sending an 18-year-old scout off on a trip like this, I suppose here's your answer. You know, he's getting a fantastic education, so borne out through his very even-handed prose. Unless, of course, maybe he actually was just writing, OMG, I was bricking it last night in those high seas, and maybe just got back to base and someone just put a red line through it and wrote it in a slightly more Boy's Own style. But I doubt it. It's explorers like these, cool to the last and indifferent to danger, that Palin and Jones affectionately sent up in the fifth yarn.
In 1927, Captain Walter Snetterton, least known of all English explorers, decided to go across the Andes by frog.
We are the expedition from England. I'm Captain Snetterton.
Wonderful characters. Pervious to anything.
Mr. Gregory, those frogs have been in training for months. They're mentally and physically at their peak. A delay could be fatal.
The nice thing about Snetterton was actually that he represents a certain type of traveller and explorer.
Yes.
Of which there are many around still who want to make it difficult for themselves.
I shall stay here until this frog expedition has achieved everything it set out to achieve.
Everyone wants to be the first to do something really, really difficult, which is actually, in a way, quite admirable. I think that's something very British and something rather good about sort of the British kind of, we would call it, some would call it silliness, others would say, it's independence and sort of testing yourself. So he was just really that kind of explorer who'd chosen to do the most difficult thing, which was to actually ride across the Andes on a frog.
The glory days of British exploration may be over, but there are still a few explorers out there. I've come to Dorset to meet the founder of Operation Rawley, John Blashford Snell. In his time, he's fought bandits, searched for meteorites in Bolivia, and taken a grand piano through the South American jungle.
Oh, Alexander, I presume.
Good morning. How very good to meet you. Wow. How many expeditions have you been on? Do you keep a tally?
I don't keep a tally, but somebody told me the other day it's over 100 now.
Over 100. Do you have a particular favourite expedition?
The most dramatic one, without a doubt, was the Blue Nile in 1968, where we literally had to fight our way out from bandits and so on, and there were crocodile attacks and that type of thing.
And you are very much in the tradition of the great British explorer. Do you see yourself in that?
Not really, no. A bit of nutcase, I think.
Really?
No, I suppose going back to the days of Stanley and Livingstone, they were all a little bit eccentric, probably, by modern standards.
John's inspiration was General Gordon and the great Victorian explorers Stanley and Livingstone.
These are some great heroes that I had as a young man who featured in the Boy's Own Paper and so on. I remember my grandmother used to read it to me.
Really?
And lots of things I learned from it. I can remember in particular with Boy's Own Paper, they taught you about making things.
Yes.
I remember making a crystal radio with instructions that were given in Boy's Own Paper.
When you just found the bits and pieces you needed?
Yeah, you made them and you could buy a few bits, but you didn't need much. The other thing was photography, and I developed an early interest in photography, and my mother, as a result of that, gave me my first camera, and there it is. And with that I took all my first pictures. Then, of course, everyone had to have a knife. Of course, nowadays that would be frowned on. And my first knife was given to me by my mother again. This was a very old sheath knife as a Boy Scout.
Yeah.
And Scouts were very much part of life. My father had been a Scoutmaster, my mother had been a guide mistress. And a friend of mine had one of these on the Blue Nile in 2005 when his inflatable boat was attacked by a crocodile. And so that was very useful in defence.
During the Second World War, the young John made his own contribution to the war effort. Now tell me about your home guard.
Well, when I was brought up in Herefordshire, of course we were very concerned with making sure the Hun didn't overrun Herefordshire. And so we recruited a gang of choir boys and choir girls and armed them to the teeth. And of course Boy's Own Paper had taught us how to make bows and arrows, and we had spears, and we would go off everywhere looking for any signs of the Hun. And we were, the ARP as they were called, the Air Raid Precautionary, used to encourage us to look for spies
I imagine the ARPs were rather glad of having this junior cadre.
Well, our job was to if the Germans had invaded, our job was to carry messages on our bicycles, and we had a little pouch, and you were told that you had to take this message from A to B if all the telephones stopped working. Luckily, it didn't get to that state. It was rather frustrating at the end of the war when the Germans hadn't invaded.
The Boys' Own paper was more than mere entertainment. It taught real practical life lessons to boys like the young John.
Such was Victoria's empire. A way of life, a state of mind, and whatever one thought of it, a mighty, powerful, impressive structure. Millions upon millions, all together under the flag upon which the sun never sets.
But while Boys' Own tales inspired and improved generations of readers, there was a more troubling aspect to them. Set in far-flung parts of the empire, many stories featured exotic foreign people, who were rarely seen in a very flattering light compared to the British.
What's the matter with them?
Yes, I'm not quite sure, actually.
One of the tricks, if you like, of the stories is that fair play is endlessly repeated as an English quality or a British quality. So it is characteristic of the portrayal of foreigners in the boys' weeklies that they are duplicitous, that they are scheming, that they are liars. And this is endlessly contrasted with the upstanding, proper English gentleman.
The papers had story after story featuring plucky British Empire gents bestowing wisdom and benevolence on grateful native populations. There is something just a little bit maddening about this constant hectoring tone that you get in some of the writing, by no means all of it, but just a tone that suggests that Britain knows best and the rest of the world should jolly well be grateful for her civilising influence.
Oh, God. I thought you were one of the Nignogs, sir.
You shouldn't call them Nignogs, Sergeant Major. They're rational human beings with an indigenous culture as worthy of respect as our own.
Yes, sir.
Of course, we have to put such attitudes into their historical context, which is very different to our own. But even at the time, some of the magazines were accused of aggressive imperialism.
For all their racism, the boys' weeklies are at least quite even-handed in their treatment of foreigners, because they disparage all of them. So an endless cast of foreigners appear.
George Orwell is pretty withering in this brilliant essay he writes on boys' weeklies. He complains that foreigners are comics who are put there for us to laugh at. They're classified in much the same way as insects. Then he goes on to list the characteristics you will invariably find in boys' weeklies. Frenchman, excitable, wears beard, gesticulates wildly. Spaniard, Mexican, etc., sinister, treacherous. Arab, Afghan, etc., sinister, treacherous. Chinese, sinister, treacherous, wears pigtail. Italian, excitable, grinds barrel organ, or carries stiletto. These snooty, patronising, even racist attitudes are key to the comedy in ripping yarns.
Making people laugh is a way of dealing with a lot of attitudes that we find difficult, and that, I think, is what sort of pushed us into making them the kind of stories they are.
In many Boys' Own stories lay a deep-rooted suspicion that Johnny Foreigner was up to no good. This anxiety reached fever pitch in the early 20th century.
The Pathans.
Anything Edna?
No. The violent but proud tribe of hill people who threaten our very existence. I must go and be kind to them.
Don't be silly, dear. The servants have orders to come and tell us of the Pathan uprising.
From
from the 1890s onwards, there was a growing worry about the threat of invasion from France, from Russia, even from the planet Mars, and these paranoias played out on the pages of boys' literature. This wonderful magazine, Chums, here in 1908, featured a story called The Perils of the Motherland, a story of war in 1911 set in the near future, and sees Britain invaded by Russia. Look at the front cover here. You can see the plucky workers of Cradley Heath in the Midlands fighting off the Russians with staves and hammers. The Russians, meanwhile, with their rifles and bayonets, these bricks hurling through the air. You've got to admire those plucky Brits. Some of them just in shirt sleeves.
We have a highly trained force waiting to move into England. 600 vicars, 1,000 shepherds.
2 divisions of cotleys.
44 judges, a dozen eccentrics, 850 private nannies.
There were lots of stories about spies. Almost the best example of this are the stories about Billy Bunter and Greyfriars School. And a lot of those stories, published by the Magnet, around 1910, are about the peculiar behaviour of people walking along the coast. And they are seen flashing lights, or they are speaking in funny languages. It appears in all the papers. I mean, it appears in the newspapers, it appears in public speeches and so on, that there was tremendous anxiety.
And born out of this pre-war paranoia was a new genre of fiction, the espionage thriller, where 1 or 2 resourceful Brits single-handedly saved the nation from a shadowy foreign threat.
My God. Kaiser.
You see it in everything, from Erskine Childer's 1903 novel Riddle of the Sands.
100,000 German troops towed across the North Sea in barges and landing on the flats of the Wash on the undefended east coast of England, with the whole Grand Fleet in support and a total element of surprise. Perfect.
To John Buchan's classic, The 39 Steps. The wildly popular Bulldog Drummond stories. And Ian Fleming's James Bond. And, let's not forget, Winfrey's Last Case.
In the last 4 months, I've brought the Balkan Wars to an end, averted a revolution in Russia for the 2nd year running, started a civil war in Persia, annexed 2 new colonies. I've been saving this country every year since 1898, and I need a holiday.
Winfrey is one of those people who, was very common in comics and literature then. Somebody who just solved all the problems of the world just like that. Was so incredibly competent and good and efficient.
Well done, generals. You've saved us again.
And what I quite liked about that is that you've got all the top brass of the army. Huge amounts of money spent on an army and air force, a navy and all that. And yet he just comes in and says, you're all wrong, I can do this.
Surely there won't be a war now. I've caught them all for you.
Oh, there will, Gerald. And it'll be a proper one, thanks to you. And if this one's successful, they'll want to do a follow-up.
And when war broke out in July 1914, it started a wave of war stories that would dominate boys' literature through the next war and beyond.
Famously, or infamously, these magazines are thought, and rightly thought, I think, to be very jingoistic, very martial in their attitude to war, and the idea that boys would find war exciting, that they would see it as an opportunity for adventure and to go off and be boys together.
Across the North Sea steamed the British fleet off the coast of Jackson. They met.
There were inspirational tales of true-life heroes like 16-year-old Jack Cornwall, fatally wounded in the Battle of Jutland in 1916 and posthumously awarded a VC. There were informational articles about uniforms, weapons, historical battles, but of course, it's impossible to tell a story like this without referring to the greatest fictional war hero of them all, Biggles. Biggles was an air ace in 2 world wars, a charter pilot, even an airborne detective. At his peak, he was the most popular juvenile fiction hero in the world.
I read Biggles when I was 12, actually. Captain W.E. Johns wrote Biggles, didn't he? Yes, very impressed with the captain bit. But I read escape stories from prisoner of war camps, and they were then coming out, and people were writing their memoirs.
They were quite nasty stories. Some of them, Bamboo and Bushido. I remember that, which is all about
Bamboo and Bushido.
Oh, it's about Japanese and how beastly they were and the tortures people, sort of in prison camps. So actually, weirdly, at quite a young age, I was exposed to some awful behaviour, but they were very gripping stories.
Hey, Virgil, what about the Red Cross? The hell with the Red Cross! Listen. What's the use of having a war when nobody does anything bad to each other?
But it was the Germans who were the #1 enemy for generations of boys.
It was perfectly okay to be critical of the Germans, or to portray the Germans as they had been portrayed in the war by our cartoonists and our publicity and all that, as all being, snarling and dangerous. Nowadays, they'd call that racist, but there was no racism then. That hadn't been identified. We just fought a war, 2 wars against the Germans. They deserved all they got, sort of thing. Now, of course, the Germans are seen, quite rightly, as very reasonable, decent Democrats and all that sort of thing. But at that time, it was something you could use, and you could use it in comedy. Although the comedy in Stalag Luft was more about obsessive escaping, because I'd read so many escape stories.
Ginger, the escape's on.
What?
It's on tonight. Let's go.
No, I don't want to go.
It's the escape.
And just the idea that the boys all want to have a night's sleep and someone comes around and says, we're going to escape tonight. Oh no, please, I'm just halfway asleep.
Carter! Oh, it's off.
Major Errol Phipps was a legend among prisoners in the First World War. He had attempted over 560 escapes, 200 of them before he left England. On arrival in Germany, he escaped regularly every day, and twice a day at weekends.
In the end, of course, they all escape apart from
him. Even the Germans escape, and just as he's about to escape, the war ends.
Major Phipps became the only man never to escape from Stalag Luft 112B. He returned home a broken man and died 3 months later. He was buried here in Totnes churchyard, and his body was found 2 years later over by the fence.
For the Boys' Own paper and many other boys' weeklies, the war meant paper shortages, an increase in price, and a decline in quality.
I took it myself in the 1940s, and I remember reading it in 1940, and it was a little compact little magazine. I tell you what it was like. It was a bit like a glossy diary. It was 64 pages. But I looked at a copy only the other day, and on those 64 pages, most of them were black and white photographs of sport, of footballers, of pop singers, and there were only about 10, 12 pages of fiction. It had become a decent general magazine. It was no longer the Boys' Own paper that it had been founded to be.
By the 60s, the paper was losing both readers and advertisers, and was facing competition from television. the magazine finally closed its doors in 1967. The most famous boys' magazine of all has gone for good, and Ripping Yarns evokes an era that many people no longer recognise.
Go on, fire! Not above their heads!
But a few remnants of that world may still remain.
I don't think the world has changed completely from the days of the public schools and all that sort of thing.
There we go, belly on the floor!
I mean, near where I live in London, they have military fitness classes where young bankers and lawyers come along to be shouted at in very cold weather and made to run up and down hills.
1, 2, 3, trust me!
And they love it, and they love it.
Yeah, they're disappointed.
It's the old cold shower regime is still there.
Coming up next this evening, see the original series in action. Michael Palin and Terry Jones's Ripping Yarns here on BBC4 in just a moment. And then at 10:30, comedy with an emerald hue. We've some Irish people with jokes. Stay with us.
How was that? Felt good?
Once again,